Welcome to Michigan's WW1 Centennial News Report for April 2017. Michigan State Troops. I'm your host, Dennis Skupinski. It was 100 years ago during April of 1917 when the United States entered the Great War. We are officially beginning Michigan's WW1 Centennial. State Report. On April 6, 2017 at 1 p.m. in Bay City at Pershing Park, the children commemorated the U.S. entry into World War I with a rededication of the Bay City Doughboy statue by John Pauling. The Doughboy statue at Pershing Park has been restored by Venus Bronze Work after 93 years. Michigan Society of Children of the American Revolution commemorated the U.S. entry into the World War. President was Madden Brady, who was responsible for raising over $13,500 for the re-bronzing of the statue. On Wednesday, April 5, 2017, at the Michigan Military Heritage Museum in Grass Lake, Michigan, a special exhibition is being held for Karl Detzer. This will run until the end of June. Karl Detzer was a soldier, writer, and patriot. He served in 2 wars plus the Mexican border. He solved the Mrs. Cyrus McCormick diamond case in Chicago for the Pinkerton Company. During World War I, he headed the Lamont District of the U.S. Army Division of Criminal Investigation, solving 100 murders in 100 days. He wrote a number of books and was the editor-at-large for Reader's Digest, making him one of the most widely read authors in history. During World War II, he also received the Distinguished Service Medal. SB 248, the establishment of a World War I Centennial Commission, has passed the Senate and is now in the Assembly. Please contact your Assembly person and let them know that you like this bill passed. Just a reminder, if you go to WW1cc.org and look up Michigan, you'll be able to keep in touch with what's going on with Michigan during the World War I Centennial. One century ago, April 2, 1917, Jeannette Rankin, Republican from Montana, begins her term as the first woman member of the U.S. House of Representatives. On April 6, 1917, the U.S. declares war on Germany and enters World War I. April 9, 1917, the British attacked the Germans near the town of Arras in France on the Western Front. The British achieved the longest advance since trench warfare had begun, surpassing the record set by the French Sixth Army on the 1st of July, 1916. The British advance slowed in the next few days, and the German defense recovered. The battle then became a costly stalemate for both sides. By May 16th, when the battle ended, the British First and Third Armies had suffered 160,000 casualties, while the German Sixth Army had 125,000 casualties. On April 10, 1917, at the Eddystone Munitions Factory in Eddystone, Pennsylvania, over 133 mostly women and girls lost their lives in a series of terrific explosions in the shrapnel building. Many rumors have circulated, but the causes have not been determined. April 16, 1917, Vladimir Lenin arrives back from exile in Russia at Finland Station, Petrograd, to join the revolution. Lenin issues his famous April Thesis calling for the Soviets to take power during the Russian Revolution. On April 24, 1917, the U.S. Congress passes the Liberty Loan Act, authorizing the Treasury Department to issue a public subscription for $2 billion in bonds for the war. On April 6, 1917, the United States declares war on Germany. the state of Michigan would play a critical role in America's war efforts as an industrial powerhouse for war production. Michigan would receive huge government contracts to produce military vehicles, ordnance, and chemical munitions. With war efforts so dependent on Michigan, this vital infrastructure was vulnerable to sabotage or to disruption from labor strikes. The advent of war gave Michigan political leaders a reason to worry for the state's internal security. Given these circumstances, the question of who would protect the state from espionage, sabotage, and labor unrest were problematic. Michigan's National Guard would soon be called into federal service with the American Expeditionary Force, and none of Michigan's 83 county sheriffs had a uniform patrol force. The jurisdictions of municipal police were limited by city boundaries, and only a handful of federal marshals were assigned to Michigan. Wartime Governor Albert Sleeper faced a crisis. On April 3rd, the day after President Wilson addressed Congress, Governor Sleeper sent his own stirring message to the legislature of Michigan, calling upon that body to mobilize Michigan's manpower and resources for the war effort. Spurred by patriotic fever, Michigan's legislature quickly passed an amended version of the Culver Military Bill to provide wartime home defense. Signed into law by the governor on April 17, 1917, Public Act 53 directed the governor to form a war preparedness board of top state officials to administer home defense measures in the absence of the state military board, and to form emergency units of Michigan state troops to assist civil authorities with law enforcement and riot suppression in the absence of the National Guard. The Michigan State Defense Force was established on 17 April 1917 by Act No. 53 in the Public Acts of Michigan, which established the Michigan State Troops. Act 53 provided for two forces to be developed. First, the Home Guard, that was to serve the military mission, interstate assignment, and service expanding and remaining needs as the Michigan National Guard was federally active for World War I. The Home Guard was a temporary force and would be known as the Michigan State Troops. The second force of the Michigan State Troops, the permanent force, would have state constabulary responsibilities and would become known as the Michigan State Police. They were usually mounted. The Michigan State Troops, known as the Home Guard, were active during World War I, World War II, the Korean Police Action, and are still in existence today. On April 17, 1917, the Michigan State Troops were organized. They were created as a temporary wartime emergency force to replace the National Guard for internal security. During the war, Michigan's population had a large number of Eastern Europeans. These people recently came over from areas that were Austro-Hungarian or German. Therefore, they could be suspect as traitors or saboteurs. Michigan also had a number of vital contracts that were essential for the United States war production and could not afford labor slowdowns or strikes. With the formation of the Michigan State Troops, the governor now had at his disposal a paramilitary force that he could use to quell labor unrest, deal with natural disasters, and also guard strategic buildings and installations throughout the state. A typical example of a World War I Michigan State Troop Company would be looked at as the 46th Company from Kalamazoo, Michigan, which was organized in April 1917 as a volunteer company of Home Guards. Later that month, the state legislature provided by law for a body of organized militia for state defense to take the place of the National Guard, after the latter had been mustered into federal service. The company of Home Guards was thereupon taken into service of the state as the 46th Company of Michigan State Troops. The term for enlistment was 3 years. The company drilled twice a week and spent 1 day a month on a government rifle range near Comstock in target practice. The purpose of the organization was primarily for the use in case of disorders occurring in the state, but it also performed a very useful service, giving preliminary training to our men who were afterwards enlisted in the federal service. Many of them became officers in the Army or Navy, and most of them were appointed non-commissioned officers or petty officers. The personnel of the company changed very rapidly on account of the men entering in the federal service. For this reason, while the average strength of the company was 80 to 90 men, the number of enlistments was much greater. In August of 1940, the U.S. Congress passed the Limited Emergency Act. Under its provisions, the Michigan contingent of the 32nd Division, Michigan National Guard, had already left for federal service, and knowing that the non-division troops would soon be ordered away, Michigan Governor Loren D. Dickinson, in accordance with the provision of Section 635, Compiled Laws of Michigan, 1929, directed the activation of the Michigan State Troops during November of 1940. Under this directive, the Adjutant General, Colonel E. M. Rosecrans, initiated the organization of approximately 6,000 troops, with Lieutenant Colonel, now Brigadier General, John H. Steck handling the necessary field work. The organization was predicated on the use of troops in their own home areas. It provided for one or more troop units at each armory being vacated by the National Guard. Armories that housed more than one company, a battalion command was formed. In addition to the Armory Command and the Armory Commander were provided a small commissioned and enlisted staff in such cases. In metropolitan area of Detroit, there were 4 Armory Commands, which made it advisable to form a district command for administrative and command purposes. Under this plan, any troops brought into an area during an emergency that might arise could come under the command of the local armory commander, and in the case of Detroit, it would be the district commander. The organization was accomplished through the selection of former National Guard, in many cases World War I officers or senior non-commissioned officers for commanding officers, and who, in turn, recommended the persons to be used for junior officers. In many instances, the officers selected for the original company organizations were later made armory commanders. During the early fall of 1941, the Michigan military establishment began uniforming the entire Guard in blue wool uniforms, overcoats, caps, and black shoes. The state of Michigan also purchased mess equipment, blankets, helmets, belts, and gas masks. During the greater part of 1941, units were instructed in disciplinary drill to aid civilian authorities and in combating the possible sabotage and fifth column activities. In December of 1941, following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Army authorities requested that the governor mobilize a company in Port Huron and one in Detroit to relieve Army personnel guarding the bridges and tunnels between the United States and Canada. On June 21, 1943, when the city of Detroit was engulfed in a storm of racial disturbances, all the troops of the 1st Michigan State Troops Division, except the 1st Engineer Battalion, were mobilized for concentration in Detroit to assist the civil authorities. A total of 2,050 troops were concentrated in the city for approximately 24 hours, with the remainder held in home armories for possible moves on short notice. In October of 1943, the 1st Engineer Battalion was mobilized to assist the State Department of Conservation in fighting devastating forest fires throughout the Upper Peninsula. These troops accredited themselves and were commended by the department. With the surrender of Japan on August 14, 1945, it was no longer necessary to maintain guards over the international bridges and tunnels. On August 19th, all troops were withdrawn. With the end of hostilities, the mission of providing security for the home front had not become less, but had increased. The troublesome times that were to follow were realized by each member of the state troops, and their loyalty in attending drill and bivouacs bore out their conviction. Each officer and man realized that the way would not be easy because the inspiration that had maintained the state troops during the war years were now gone. Regardless of the obstacles they faced, the spirit to go on prevailed. At the conclusion of World War II, state defense forces were disbanded after Congress repealed the federal authority under the Defense Act of 1916 for states to establish their own defense force. However, as the Korean War began, the need for these units was felt again, and in 1950, PL 81-849 was enacted, permitting states to organize and maintain a state defense force for a period of 2 years. During the years of the Korean conflict, 26 units of Michigan National Guard were called into federal service. In response, Michigan state troops were reorganized and activated in September 1950 and given a special appropriation by the state legislature. During this time, there were approximately 700 individuals serving in the Michigan state troops. The Michigan state troops were disbanded after its federal authority was terminated and state funding ceased. This was the last time a state defense force was activated until peacetime force was established in the late 1980s. In 1957, the state military laws were recodified through the enactment of the Michigan Military Act, Public Act No. 150. The act permitted the governor to establish the Michigan Defense Force as deemed necessary for the protection of the state when the President calls the National Guard into federal service in time of national emergency. The act further provided that the Michigan Defense Force disband when an adequate number of National Guard troops return to state control. The Michigan State Troops were reconstituted as the Michigan Emergency Volunteers by Public Act 246 in 1988. The original intention of the Michigan Emergency Volunteers was to act as a force of trained emergency volunteers in the event that the National Guard were sent out of state in a national emergency. The Michigan Emergency Volunteers were ordered to stand down in October of 1998. The Michigan Volunteer Defense Force is a military force duly constituted as a state defense force and an element of the Michigan Department of Military and Veterans Affairs. The Michigan Volunteer Defense Force was reorganized from the former Michigan Emergency Volunteers by Adjutant General Thomas Cutler in 2004 to fill a Homeland Security role in the state of Michigan. Today, the Michigan Volunteer Defense Force is organized as a statewide brigade composed of 7 field battalions located within the former state police and Office of Public Health districts. Each battalion is being developed to serve and support community needs across the state of Michigan, to provide reliable personnel support to local and state agencies during declared emergencies. Members of the Michigan Volunteer Defense Force may be ordered to active service in the case of riot, tumult, breach of peace, resistance of process, or for the service and aid of civil authority, whether state or federal, in time of actual or imminent public danger, disaster, crisis, catastrophe, or other public emergency within the state, or response to the acts or threats of terrorism, or to safeguard military and other vital resources of the state.
And then put your arm down, because that was not a command. That was just a way to get yourself placed because you were told to fall in. Now the front row is golden. This is the right guidon position. This guy is always correct. Raise your hand. This person is who everyone else lines up to. Person in the right front position. Face. Right face. Left face. Right face. About face. Present arms.
Training for the Michigan Volunteer Defense Force consists of classroom training, drill, and also field exercises.
First Lieutenant Dave Washburn. I'm with 2nd Battalion, Company D of the Michigan Volunteer Defense Force. And 2017 marks our centennial year in the founding of the Michigan State Troops, of which we are a descendant organization from the Michigan State Troops. We are part of the Michigan Department of Defense, and we are associated with the National Guard, but the difference with us is twofold. One is we are only authorized to be activated by the governor of the state for service within the state of Michigan in times of emergency. Second is we are not an armed force. We are mainly serving as a emergency response force, and so our primary purpose is to provide a military force for the governor to use in time of war when the National Guard is not present. In other words, when they've been federalized and they're overseas, the governor can use the Michigan Volunteer Defense Force to respond to emergencies. The reason why the Michigan State Troops were originally formed in 1917 is because the history of some of the conflicts that happened before that, dating back to the Spanish-American War. Volunteers were asked to be provided by every state for the Spanish-American War, and Michigan raised 5 regiments of infantry. Many of them saw service because we had Secretary of State Alger was from Michigan, so they did get to Cuba. However, there was a problem when the war with Spain was declared. Obviously, Spain had Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Most of those places saw some type of military action. When Spain actually sued for peace and the war ended in August of 1898, there were still troops in the Philippines. And the Filipinos, who thought they were going to get their independence from Spain, found out the Americans were not going to let them be totally independent, started fighting U.S. forces there. Local governments from many states complained to the federal government that their troops were only volunteering for the war with Spain, and now this other war was something different. They called their troops home. So many state volunteer organizations had to bring their troops home. The government then reformed U.S. volunteer regiments and sent those troops back to Cuba in addition to the regular army to continue fighting in the Philippines for many, many years. Officially, the war in the Philippines ended in 1901, but it dragged on well into 1912 in various skirmishes. So this was a eye-opening experience for the federal government that they couldn't rely on the state volunteers anymore. That's when the National Guard system was really established, which meant that those National Guard units that were under the command of the governor during peacetime could be federally mobilized and mustered into federal service during wartime. Then fast forward to 1916, we have Pancho Villa's raid on Columbus, New Mexico. The National Guard is deployed along the southern border of the United States. World War I is happening in Europe. It's pretty soon the United States gets dragged into World War I. Suddenly all these National Guard troops that are from various states become federalized, and they're going to France. This was a wake-up call to many of the state governments that they had no National Guard at home for any type of labor unrest, natural disaster, emergency, or even they were very concerned about sabotage at home. That's when most of the state defense forces were legalized and brought forth by legislation, including Michigan, in April of 1917.
So our unit insignia is very similar to the National Guard. It's got the same Griffin symbol. However, we utilize the lightning bolt through in red to make our unit distinctly different from the National Guard. All of our members are CERT trained, which is Community Emergency Response Team. So we are trained in FEMA courses to respond to numerous emergencies. And we have other tabs for specialties such as search and rescue, amateur radio, and medical that we train with for the MIVD. So one primary difference in the uniform of the Michigan Volunteer Defense Force is the Michigan state flag replaces the U.S. state flag on the uniform, so that people are pretty aware from a distance that we are not federal troops or National Guard. We are an equivalent of a state defense force, which many states have, not all states. But Michigan refers to them officially as the Michigan Volunteer Defense Force. So the other part of the uniform that's uniquely different is the Michigan tape. This is the replacement for what is normally worn on the ACU uniform. It says U.S. Army. In this case, it says Michigan. So that also identifies us as the Michigan Volunteer Defense Force or a state guard unit. So if you do see film footage of some type of a disaster where you'll see uniformed individuals responding to that, make sure you look for their shoulder sleeve insignia to see if it's a flag of the state that they're in, and maybe their state name tape. You'll see that, like Georgia, for example, Texas. Many other states have their own state defense forces, and that's how they tell the difference between regular National Guard or Army and state defense forces. The Michigan Volunteer Defense Force also has a website, mivdf.org, and that website does have all of our stated missions defined there. In there you'll find a lot of the information about our emergency response role, but also we do other things. We also help with National Guard retirement services to counsel and inform National Guard retirees on their benefits. We also work a refugee
receive and redeployment mission, which specifically takes in displaced persons from other catastrophe areas and puts them into temporary housing or moves them on to other locations. We also train for some type of a chemical or biological attack where agents would be dispersed to a population, perhaps by a terrorist organization, where we would have to respond with medical or antidote type treatments. We would take those shipments of that material and stage it for distribution to the population. And most of our missions are all based on potential either disasters, natural disasters, or man-made terrorist attacks that could occur within the state. The Michigan Volunteer Defense Force is always looking for recruits. You do not have to be prior service. You can be non-prior service. We do a limited basic training. We're open from ages to 17 to 65. So individuals that want to seek out potential recruitment into the organization are welcome to go to our website, contact their local battalion in their area, and they're free to visit and join in on some of their training operations as a visitor before they sign up. And we do have an enlistment of 3 years. There is a background check that they do have to pass, and there is an oath that they are taken when they are sworn in. But it's a rewarding way for people to volunteer their time and do something special for their community and be trained for emergency responses, which is always good training to have in any situation.